overwhelmed with good events here, certainly on the Immigration and Deportation Initiative, which is essentially the largest public initiative that this college has engaged in, certainly since I've been here the last 2 decades. And of course, as many of you know, if you've come to any previous events, it's entirely appropriate, that we have a very powerful presence on this issue at this period of time. Read any newspaper today, and you'll read something about deportations. We're now over 400,000 per year, with a person who came to office stealing the motto of Cesar Chavez, yes we can, yes we can deport you, yes we can imprison you, yes we can do lots of things on behalf of the security state, yes we can. However, those of us who want a different kind of world, a different kind of democracy, say no you can't. No, you can't do this without our permission. No, you can't do this without our political will. No, you can't do this stepping over the tens of thousands of families that have been socially injured by this extraordinary process. And it is an extraordinary process of deportation coming up in this third millennium. And so I'm very proud and privileged to bring together tonight three of my colleagues that I've met along the way in trying to research this issue of forced repatriation. I started looking into the subject something like 13 years ago with my colleague Luis Barrios, totally through serendipity, as part of a study into street organisations in New York City, or what some people refer to as gangs, and coming across this phenomenon that so many of them and their families were being forced into exile. And I remember distinctly giving a talk in Santo Domingo at the end of 2 or 3 years of this ethnographic research at a criminology conference, ostensibly to talk about the Dominican youth subcultures of New York City, and coming to the end of my talk and thought I had made a number of interesting points, and then saying, anybody got any questions and comments, and nobody said a word. There was nothing about what I'd said, and I thought I'd cocked it up, thought I said all the wrong bloody things or something. But what people wanted to talk about, and they said, one person hesitantly put their hand up and said, I said, what do you want to talk about? And this person said, well, why are you sending them all back here? I said, what are you talking about? She said, all your bloody gang members in New York City, Stage. All your gang members in New York City, why are you sending them all back here? What have we done to deserve these people? And, la la la. Why are they causing all the crime rate to increase and so on? So I had actually no idea what she was talking about. And but I said, Luis and I, we're supposed to be communities, committed to the community, to have back our knowledge to the community, not simply to build our careers. We'll find out what's going on. This was in '98, 2 years after draconian immigration laws of '96. And several years passed, and then finally spent a year in the Dominican Republic talking to the people who were supposedly behind the massive increase of crime and drugs and mayhem in that fair country. And during that process, understood, realised, very much touched by the extraordinary levels of social trauma being carried out in a so-called democratic country against people who are largely some of the most vulnerable communities in that country, inside the United States. And so we carried on, and we did our interviews and our observations, and we did the first Caribbean conference on deportations ever in 2003, and then we did one of the first in this country, in the gymnasium here, in 2004. And along the way, Dan wrote his book, Deportation Nation, sort of became the Bible of deportation studies. And Bernard did his studies in Jamaica that accorded with what we were finding, that indeed the deportees were not behind the spikes in crime. In fact, we found them incredibly, counterintuitively, not going back into the mix when their life chances were sharply curtailed in their country of exile. And my connection to Steve Vigil is in the 2004 conference. We invited his comrade and colleague Alex Sanchez from Los Angeles, who at that point was the first gang member to be repatriated back into the United States from El Salvador, and was one of the co-leaders of an important group called Hombres Unidos that tries to work with ex-members of the Mother Salvatore in the 18th Street, which he's going to talk about. So these three gentlemen here I've come across in the arc of my work, and have appreciated and continue to appreciate everything they've done on behalf of one of the most vilified populations. I mean that across the globe at the present time. So, without further ado, we're going to begin with Dan Kanstroom from Boston College. Dan is Professor of Law and the Director of the International Human Rights Program and Associate Director of the Boston College Center for Human Rights and International Justice. Dan's first book was called Deportation Nation in 2007, and his second book is Aftermath, about the constituency, the new population that he's calling the New American Diaspora. So, let's welcome Dan Kanstroom.
Deportation is a very peculiar thing to think about, and the first thing I want to begin with is the idea that you have to think about it as a system with great contradictions that are built into it, and these are contradictions that actually have always been part of the United States experiment. So my first book was an attempt to show that these are not new issues. They've always been present in the very idea of America. There's an idea of welcoming people, but there's also always been an idea of excluding people, an idea of judging certain types of people. And that idea, just to give it a big headline, has also always been racialized in the history of this country. So those are two big ideas. The third big idea is that I have a PowerPoint, but I can't do anything because I don't have a click. Oh, that was my fault, sorry. So I'm going to talk about deportation. Let's see. So the first thing I think it's important to start with is that the United States it was called a nation of immigrants in a book by John Kennedy. He wrote it actually in 1958, but it became more famous years after that when his legacy was part of the reformation of the immigration system in 1965, which is something I'll talk a little bit more about. But this idea of nation of immigrants is easy to criticize, easy to mock in various ways. It has contradictions that are easy to call, but I actually think it's quite important. So let me give you two reasons why I say this country is a nation of immigrants and what I think is important about it. First of all, we have coming into this country hundreds of millions of people every year who come in as tourists, students, workers. It is quite a large flow of people who come in the country, and for the most part who go out of the country. We're here on temporary visas. We take in over 1 million people per year as LPRs. Oh, I should say also I'm a lawyer, and a lot of this work comes out of legal work that I do, as well as scholarly work. So sometimes I may use some legal shorthand for things, but if I say something and you don't know what I'm talking about, I just tell my students to do this. Just like jump up in your seat or slam a book down. You know, what? You know, or just give me like a signal of WTF or something. LPRs are lawful permanent residents. There's about 1 million of those who come in per year. We have a very large population of lawful permanent residents, quite large by any comparative measure to other countries around the world. Actually, the numbers of non-immigrant admissions and lawful permanent resident admissions are large by historical standards as well, for the most part. We have a relatively easy naturalization process compared to a lot of countries. There are a lot of countries in Europe where it's quite a bit harder to become a citizen. Not to say it's easy here. There are a lot of problems with that system. I've actually written a lot about those problems. But a lot of people do naturalize, hundreds of thousands per year. And we have a relatively generous program for refugees and asylees, although again, there are a lot of problems in this. And I do make my living actually criticizing a lot of these systems. But even as I criticize the system, I have to say, there are a lot of people coming into this country. And this is more than just a fact. It is part of our national mythology. And I actually think that this idea of national mythology is worth taking seriously, particularly if you compare it to certain other countries. Let's say, for example, Germany or Japan or Korea, that don't have this idea of being a nation of immigrants. Actually, in Germany, for many years, the government had an official slogan. They said, "Wir sind kein Einwanderungsland." We are not a country of immigrants. But the United States, the idea is we are a country of immigrants. And this has implications because it means that we have a national idea that diversity is a good thing, that it's a core of what this country is, that pluralism is important, that we have a relatively open society. There are new people coming in all the time. That has a refreshing, energizing function, that it's a dynamic society. Immigrants tend to be younger and more energetic than citizens, actually. They outwork and outperform citizens by almost all measures. So all of these things I think are quite good, and I think they have implications for our ideas of human rights. But I began by saying it's complicated and there's always been a contradiction. And here's an example of the contradiction that goes back to 1783. This is George Washington giving a speech to Irish immigrants who were the illegal immigrants of the day. People said that Irish, they're dirty, they're lazy, they're criminals, they're alcoholics, they have too much sex, they have too many children, you know, everything you can think about. And he's speaking to them, and he gives the classic statement of the United States. He says, "The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and the respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome." That was an incredible thing in 1783, and I still think it's a pretty incredible thing today. It's something we should cherish and hold on to and nurture. But, he then said, "if by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the enjoyment." So to a lawyer's eye, and I hope to your eyes, that's a red flag. That's why I made it red, because the question is, who defines what's decency? Who defines what is proper conduct? And who defines what it means to merit the enjoyment of the United States? So there's always been this struggle. And deportation is the mechanism through which that struggle is played out internationally. So if you fall on the wrong side of this statement, you tend to get deported. And that was always true. But it has never been true in any degree close to how true it's been for the last 25 years in this country. We are living in the middle of an incredible, radical social experiment. It is amazing that more people don't realize how large and how incredibly radical the deportation experiment of this country is. It's been going now for about a quarter century, and I'll tell you some statistics as I go forward to illustrate how large it is. Why has it happened? Well, here's just a little demography. You can see that the percentage of foreign-born in this country is actually at historically high levels. And again, as a nation of immigrants, you might think that that would be a good thing, but it has tended to provoke reaction by native-born citizens whenever we have seen these kind of spikes. Again, we've never seen a reaction like the one we've seen recently, and I will tell you the reason, although it's based on something I said before, I don't think you'll be surprised. What has happened here? The immigration system of the United States changed dramatically in 1965. Up until 1965, basically there was a national origins quota system in this country that for the most part meant that most of the immigrants were coming to this country from Europe. That was the historical pattern. It was mostly white people. Very few Latinos, very few Asians were able to immigrate legally. This began to change, and it started to change the composition of the immigrant flow quite dramatically. So you can read all this as I'm talking. I hope you can read and listen at the same time. I always say to my kids, that's why you have ears and eyes, both, but I know it's hard to do at the same time. So we could go back during the discussion. But essentially what has happened is that the ethnic and racial composition of the immigrant flow to this country changed dramatically after 1965. And at the same time, what started to happen, and what came to fruition, just as the cohort of the children of these first immigrants are coming of age and are reaching young adulthood, that's when the deportation system starts to pick up and starts to change. So this could be seen as a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think these things are deeply linked. And again, in discussion, we can talk more about it. So these are some of the markers. The peculiar marker here is 1996. 1996 was when immigration law definitively changed, took a radical turn. Many of the mechanisms that had been in place to allow judges to say, well, maybe you did something wrong, but maybe I'll forgive it. Maybe I'll consider, if you have children, I won't deport you. That was the way it was for 100 years before 1996. But in 1996, the Congress passed a package of laws that removed a lot of that, what we call it in lawyer talk, discretion. The idea that a judge can give mercy to somebody. That was taken away. And the laws were hardened so that it used to be you had to do a pretty bad thing, a pretty serious felony to get deported. In fact, you often had to do more than one to get deported, especially if you were a lawful permanent resident. But in 1996, that was changed. They passed a series of laws that basically, a lot of them were one strike and you're out, particularly for drug offenses. Now, why do I have this guy's face up there? This guy was not deported. I don't know if people remember this guy, but this is Timothy McVeigh. What motivated the passage of the laws in 1996 was the Oklahoma City bombing. And in the immediate aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, the first news reports were that people saw some, they called it on CNN, swarthy foreigners who were running away from the scene, and the thought was, this must be immigrant terrorists. And meanwhile, this package of laws had been prepared, and they were waiting for the right moment to bring it through. And so it was actually Timothy McVeigh who caused this to happen in many ways, and elaborated on in the aftermath of September 11th. Marshall McLuhan once said, in fact, I don't know who discovered water, but I know that it wasn't a fish. So think about that for a minute. Again, I want to come back to the idea that this is a very understudied and underappreciated area of law and of policy. I mean, there are very few people who are actually talking about deportation. So I will leave it to you to ask yourselves why that is. But even in the talk about the dreamers and the talk about reforming the immigration system and fixing our broken immigration system, there's very little discussion of really repealing what was done in 1996. Even liberals, even Barack Obama, even people in his administration for whom I have respect, are not wanting to talk about this. They want to keep it this way, and in fact, they actually benefit in many ways politically from keeping it this way. But I will urge you to think about the water in which we're swimming as we go forward with this. Anybody who is not a U.S. citizen potentially faces deportation. This often comes as a surprise to clients of mine. People with green cards who have been in the country for 20 or 30 years and have family, they can face deportation just the same as a kid who just crossed over from Ciudad Juarez. You know, the system is the same so long as you are not a citizen. The numbers are quite staggering. Actually, David understated it because formal removals, the ones in court, are at about 400,000 per year. But in fact, if you total up all the various mechanisms that the government has created to deport people of various types and statuses, we've been pretty close to 1 million people per year for quite some time now. So that is a big system. And it's added up to this. Since 1980, the number of times that there's been an individual non-citizen caught somewhere on U.S. soil and determined to be subject to deportation has exceeded 35 million events. So we are talking about the population of a pretty good-sized country that has actually been removed from this country. Now, of course, you're all smart, so you could say to me, well, actually 35 million events could have been one guy who was deported 34 million times. That's true. I'm not sure it's 35 million different people, but it's a lot of different people. And that's the size of the system we're talking about, which again, I think makes it quite remarkable. Let me skip over this. Spending. We're up around $17 billion per year now on immigration enforcement. That is a lot of money. And what this book, the newer book that I published a couple of years ago, is about is trying to do an audit of that. So to ask, what have we really gotten for our money? Why did we do this? What are we gaining? And actually, it turns out that if you really look at it, it's very hard to say that we've gained anything. But the costs have actually been staggering. Not only the money the government is spending, but the cost of children who are deprived of parents who are deprived of children who take care of them in their old age, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the countries to which the deportees are sent, which I'm going to turn to. So I don't want to take too much time. The vast majority of criminal deportees are deported for nonviolent offenses. Typically drugs, often marijuana, actually, although that's beginning to be cut back. But that's the most typical scenario. And we know that in the 10-year period from 2001 to 2010, there were over 1 million people deported because of some kind of post-entry criminal conduct. Most of those people were otherwise in legal status. Let me just make it clear because people get confused about this. Some people think that deportation is something that affects people who don't have papers or who are undocumented. That is true, although that's less true in this administration than it was in the Bush administration when they were doing all these workplace raids. But it is also true that there are many, many hundreds of thousands of people who thought they were secure in this country. So this requires us to think about what is it that we're doing here. And I don't have time to go into the details of this other than to say that scholars have begun to work on this question of what is the nature of this system. Is it basically about border control? Is it basically about crime control? Is it basically about the rule of law? You hear people saying they broke the law, they should pay the penalty. Like what they say, what's so complicated about that? And I just want to suggest that there's a lot that's complicated about that. In fact, in the book I say, when people say they broke the law, period. But what lawyers say is if you say somebody broke the law, the next punctuation should be a question mark, not a period. Because the question is, what should society do about it when somebody has broken the law? I mean, people break laws all the time, and there are a range of things that happen to people because of that. So we have the problem of the so-called illegal alien, which is a linguistic problem. And I don't use that term. I actually asked my students to come up with a term, and they came up with the term documentarily challenged. People otherwise might be called illegal alien. I have actually a new book that's coming out that deals with this question of illegality. I mean, the basic problem, I imagine I don't have to spend a lot of time with this group to talk about it, is that there's really nowhere else in the legal system, except possibly with sex offenders, where you say that the person carries within them the idea of illegality. Normally, what we talk about in law is conduct is illegal, and the government has to walk a long, hard mile to achieve that goal. You have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury. The defendant doesn't have to say anything. So to now say that people, in their essence, are illegal is a very strong thing to say about people, and I don't think it's the right way to approach it. Let me skip over a couple of things because I'm afraid that I'm going to take too much time. I will say, though, that there's been some very good research recently exploring this question. What do young immigrants tend to commit more crimes than citizens? Because if they do, then one might say, well, maybe the deportation does make sense as a crime control measure. But it turns out that the data show exactly the opposite. The single best predictor of criminality in life is gender, males. But moving aside from that, the second best predictor of criminality is citizenship status. Citizens are much more likely to commit crimes than non-citizens. And the longer a person has lived in the United States, the more likely they are to commit a crime. So in a way, you could say that the United States culture is turning a lot of these young men towards crime. So it's a complicated reality, but the point is, the data has shown that deportation is not really much of a solution to this problem. So what about this idea of diaspora? It occurred to me, normally diaspora, which is originally a Greek word and is applied to Armenians and Jews and various types of ethnic and religious groups that have been scattered. It's the scattering of the seeds. Doesn't usually apply to deportation. But the turn since 1996, the critical thing, is that we now have this population of people in large numbers all over the world, we're going to talk more about where, who actually identify as Americans. They speak English as their primary language. In my world, they tend to root for the Boston Red Sox, sorry. They really think of themselves as Americans, and yet here they are in the Dominican Republic, in Jamaica, in Haiti, in the Azores, in Cape Verde, and they don't know who they are, and they don't know what connections they have. And it's a really strong thing to tear people away from their culture and their families and leave them in a country where many of them don't even speak the language anymore, let alone have any contact. So I argue that this is a pretty good working definition of diaspora, and this term is actually useful to explain how they have this sense of identity, this sense of Americanness, and yet they find themselves in these other places. How am I doing on time? Should I lost track? Just a couple more. Okay, so I'm going to skip the lecture on the Constitution and get right to the work that we're doing in our project. I'd be happy to talk in questions more about this. So we have tried to begin to work with people and examine what the effects of deportation are. And these effects are quite profound. We are actually doing studies at Boston College of the effects of deportation on children, particularly Guatemalan children, which is a community that happens to be quite well represented in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and in that area. A lot of Mayans, actually. Many people who don't speak Spanish, but who were recruited to come up and work in various factories and move them and get deported. But in general, across the country, we know that there are over 100,000 parents of U.S. citizen children who were deported in just one 10-year period. So this means that there's a lot of families that have really been torn apart, and there have been good studies now that have examined what the effects on these families are. In our studies, we are seeing long-lasting effects. We're seeing anxiety disorders in children. We're seeing educational consequences. We're seeing a lot of pain and suffering in these children. And I'll talk more about the specifics of it because with the Guatemalans, there's a unique problem that is actually going to connect up to our discussion of the Salvadorans. Basically, a lot of these people were fleeing a war and a genocide, not to put it too finely. So we created this project called the Post-Deportation Human Rights Project, and it was originally called the Ruby Slippers Project, but I'll explain in questions why we changed the name. And what we actually do is represent people now all over the world. We get telephone calls, we get emails, we get letters. In fact, we have a satellite center in a town in Guatemala called Zacualpa, where we have some staff. We're actually meeting with deportees. We're trying to help people stay connected to their families, to feel empowered, to feel like they still have some connection to the culture. And actually, we're trying to change the law. When I started this, the U.S. government had a rule, or federal regulation, that said, once you are deported, your case is over. So you could be deported and then discover that you were deported by mistake. They got the wrong guy, or the criminal record was wrong, or, as has happened again and again and again, the government theory was rejected ultimately by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, no, you should not have been deporting Mexican grandfathers as violent criminals when what they were actually convicted of was driving while intoxicated. That's an example. That's a real example. So that regulation said it doesn't matter. Once you're out, you're out. So it's like Guantanamo Bay. It's like a legal black hole. You couldn't reopen the cases. So we have challenged that together with other organizations all over the country now. We've won in virtually every federal circuit. So now deportees who were wrongly deported actually have a chance to reopen their cases. And that opens up a vast area of law, but also of other types of research possibilities. And that's what we're doing. By the way, as I see Jackie Stevens is here, I'll highlight as a leading scholar in the field as well. A lot of U.S. citizens have been deported by mistake as well. The system is so massive that mistakes get made all the time. Actually, it's an inherent component of the system. I'm coming around to that. And this is the basic question. I also teach human rights law. So, are human rights real or are they a fairy tale? What we're trying to do is encourage the U.S. government to take human rights seriously for the deportees. And what we know is that there have been all of these kinds of things: deportations of U.S. citizens, incorrect deportations, legal malpractice, and hardship, and so forth. And we're trying to change it. So sorry, I'm going to just tell you that, actually, I think maybe I'll wrap it up there, only to say that in addition to the harm to their dignity that the deportees talk about when they say, I should not have been deported in the first place, we also get reports about what it's like to live as a deportee. And it is just an incredibly difficult experience. In many countries, particularly Cambodia, which is one of the first places that we started doing this work, there's a component of shame to it, for one thing, where we have people who were carried from the killing fields as toddlers by their mothers, who then suddenly grow up and find themselves being sent back to the country from which their mothers fled. So it's an embarrassing thing. But there's also a profound sense of injustice and a profound sense of isolation. We see this from all over the world. The Guatemalans in particular talk about it as una segunda guerra, one woman described it. It's like a second war. She said, we came through all this, and now we come here, and now our family has to face separation. After all the genocide and all the violence in Guatemala, we thought we had made it out, and now they're sending us back. So it's really tragic. I like to end with this quotation from a Supreme Court case that illustrates something that I think is really important in my own conceptualization of why I do this. This is not charity work. I don't do this, I don't encourage my students to do this with an idea of us doing something for some unfortunate them. This is who we are. What we are trying to do is repair the fabric of the American constitutional experiment. And deportation has really torn that fabric apart because it's a vulgar, pornographic example of government power with little restraint. And we really need to work to reform it on all levels. So I will end with this. And thank you very much for your time.
On to our second speaker, Steve Vigil, who's the co-chair of the Transnational Advisory Group in support of the peace process in El Salvador. Steve started his career with the National Coalition for Barrios Unidos, California-based non-government organization whose mission is the promotion of peace and development in communities affected by youth violence and gang warfare in the United States and Latin America. From there he joined the United Nations and has worked in several capacities at the UN Secretariat in New York and in post-conflict peacekeeping missions including East Timor, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Sudan and South Sudan. Let's welcome Steve Vigil.
Hi, good evening. First off, I'd like to thank you all for John Jay for having us here tonight. So a great honor to be here at the table with these gentlemen right here. I'm actually speaking, this is the second time I've spoke today on a similar issue. Earlier today I was at a Museo del Barrio. There was a play called De Novo, which is a play about a true story about a young Guatemalan kid who was deported in 2004 and subsequently killed upon arrival in Guatemala by the gang that he had fled from. So I think it's pretty timely that we're having the same discussion here. A little bit about myself. I got involved with this work as a young man coming out. I'm originally from the state of Colorado. On my father's side, I'm Chicano, Mexican-American, for those who don't know. Not an immigrant, but we're the ones that were left here when the U.S. took over that part of the country. But my experience growing up with deportations didn't have anything to do with what it's like today, but it had more to do with the Mexicanos that grew up in the communities around us. It was a very common practice at the end of the growing season that the owners would call the immigration and people would get deported. So as a young man, I saw the scars that left on the families amongst the people that I grew up with. Friends of mine who were born here, who came to school one day and said it was their last day at school and they were going back to Mexico, because there had been a raid the day before at one of the farms or what have you. So that was my experience with deportation and immigration.
Sorry, the chair broke. I'm not drunk. Fine, sorry about that.
Somebody must have known he was a Red Sox fan.
Sit carefully.
So, like I was saying, that was kind of my experience with deportation and what the effect on the communities. As I I moved out to California to go to school, and I got involved working with violence prevention work with an organization called Barrios Unidos. Part of the reason I did that was within our own community, we had a high degree of young men who were getting caught up in the criminal justice system through involvement in gangs. My perception of immigrants was not that they were going to be in gangs. There was a very distinct distinction there was a distinction in Colorado between those of us that were Chicanos that grew up and were from there and those who were Mexicanos, and there was a little friction between that, but it certainly, when it came to the idea of who was in a gang and who were gang members, it was generally that those of us that were born here were more likely to be the gang members, and it was rare that you would see someone as an immigrant involved in the gangs. When I moved to California and I started working with this organization, I started seeing that this was a very different situation. And I'm going to speak a little bit towards the situation with Central Americans, in particular El Salvador. In my current role, I've been involved with the grassroots advocacy effort to support a gang truce that's happening in El Salvador right now that's been in existence about a year and 9 months now. I'm not going to speak so much about that activity so much as I want to talk about how it came to be that there are LA-based gangs in El Salvador in the first place. When I arrived in California in the late 80s, it was interesting for me to see that, and when starting to work in these communities, that you had communities of people who had come here fleeing the war, but then found themselves living in some of the rougher communities in California. It's most famously known for downtown MacArthur Park, Rampart area, and this is the birthplace of the Marasao Trucha, and also the 18th Street Gang, which oftentimes these gangs are attributed to being from Central America, when in actuality they're gangs from Los Angeles. 18th Street is one of the older Mexican-American gangs that has its origins from the 40s or 50s. NMS started in the late 70s or the 80s by Salvadoran immigrant kids that were basically having to defend themselves against other kids. But the situation that brought them there, I think, is something that people that often gets left out of the mix in the discussion. There was some, particularly in El Salvador and Guatemala as well, the wars that were going on in the 80s pushed a lot of people coming from rural areas to leave the countries and come up here. So when they arrived, a lot of these young people many of them had already had experience in warfare. Many of them had actually been child soldiers. That's something that's left out. And when they, in talking to some of the guys that work, and Alex Sanchez, who Dave referenced earlier, and some of the people I work with in our organization in Los Angeles, they actually mentioned the fact that when the Salvadorans hit Los Angeles, the game changed a bit. Because previously, I think maybe, in New York there might be a similar situation. You could tell when a kid just arrives from overseas. Definitely in California it was the street style that was prevalent in the Southwest was not something that you had in these countries. So it was pretty clear when somebody came from someplace else, the joke was their pants were too tight, too high, their hair was all long and everything, when the other people there had their slick, we had our pants baggy, creased, and all this and that. It's a different style than New York, y'all. But so these kids came around, and the kids in the neighborhood were like, these are just the other mojados just arrived, and they started punking them. But that wasn't the case. These kids had been coming from a situation of warfare, a lot of them having been child soldiers that I mentioned themselves, and they quickly organized. Fast forward to 1992 and the LA riots. One of the outcomes of the LA riots was that California started deporting criminal aliens. And it was really heavily targeted it was heavily targeted at these particular neighborhoods where MS and 18th Street had gotten really strong. Another thing that happened in 1992 was that the war in El Salvador came to an end. So those that were up here that did have some sort of status, and I don't believe too many Salvadorans had actual refugee status, and I'm not sure, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the actual legal term, but whatever status they had also expired at the end of that conflict. So you suddenly had a situation where thousands of young men who had primarily had not been born, but had been raised in California, particularly in Los Angeles, started arriving in El Salvador at a time when people didn't know who they were, and the country itself was going through a big transition. It was a post-conflict period. There was a period where the former rebels were coming into government and so everyone was focusing on what the next steps were. And suddenly you got a bunch of guys from California who land there, many of them not even speaking Spanish, and having to negotiate, living in a country that they know very little of, don't have family in, because most of their families they were still in California, and often were in situations of homelessness themselves. They also arrived in a place where there had been a high degree of violence and a lot of young people, a lot of young kids that were orphans or were homeless themselves, either because their parents had been killed in the war, or they had come up here as immigrants and were trying to support them from this country. So, when I talk to these guys, they say, you know what, we were, when we first got there, we were the cool kids. We were the guys from California. We had the tattoos. We spoke a different slang. We dressed a different way. People wanted to hang out with us. But at the same time they had that dynamic, they also still had the war that they had carried with them from Los Angeles down to El Salvador. And just because you were from an MS neighborhood in LA didn't guarantee that when you arrived in El Salvador, you were going to end up in an MS area. And they started finding themselves that the same problems they had in California, they were starting to have down there. And they also had a large pool of recruits from the young men that were on the street. They also still had an issue of the disarmament that was not very complete. And this is where kind of my two worlds collide, in the sense of my background as a community organizer, and then fast forward to working in the United Nations and post-conflict countries overseas. The UN has very specific steps that it takes when it comes into a post-conflict situation. Some of which I'd like to think they learned from the experience in El Salvador and other places, where you do come in and you do have a disarmament. You do have something called a reintegration, where you look at all the former combatants from the different sides and figure out how to get them back in place in society. Because that's a key thing that needs to take place. If you don't reintegrate the people that were actually fighting in the first place, and society's not going to move forward. They have the concept of the spoilers. These guys are going to be the problem if you don't reintegrate them. This is something that did not happen in El Salvador for a variety of reasons, I think mainly political. So you had a large number of arms on the street. You had these guys who had arrived from California, and then you had a lot of guys who had spent the last 10, 15 years fighting war who had nothing to do anymore. And another issue is that the reasons why there was a war in El Salvador in the first place were never addressed, in terms of the inequality, the lack of opportunities for the community. These sort of things did not get addressed as the situation was worked out politically between the different parties. So following the riots, and then again, as Dan pointed out, after 1996, it became a federal policy of deporting criminal aliens. So you had the population growing down there, and at the same time, through different reasons having to do with a lot of reasons that these countries went to war in the first place, these gangs were able to flourish. So suddenly you had kids that were all over in small communities around El Salvador claiming LA-based gangs. At that time, I moved from California to Washington, D.C. to work in the community there, and you started seeing the first wave of people coming to this country claiming gangs. And relating this to this discussion on deportation, in the early 90s, when they started doing the criminal deportations, there was a small group of us, and we were a small group lobbying in D.C. saying, this is not how you're going to deal with violence in our communities. The violence that takes place in our communities in this country is something that developed in this country. By sending these young people away, especially sending them to a situation where they don't know where they're going, and the people who are down there don't know who they are, this isn't how you're going to stop the spread of gangs. This is how you're going to accelerate it. And what we started seeing in 1996, when I was in Washington, D.C., you started seeing the first wave of Central American kids coming to this country, claiming LA gangs, but who had never actually been to this country before. And weren't necessarily even coming from San Salvador or Guatemala City or anything like that. They were coming from some of the provinces outside. So that's just kind of the story in terms of the deportation, and I think from the start, where it didn't work out. What did they arrive to at the time? Well, over the last several years, one of the things that happened is they become more and more, once people were able to identify them, a lot more focus was put on the gangs. Now, mind you, when we were down there we did a visit a year and a half back to meet the gang leaders who had signed the truce and the government officials. And one thing that came across from everybody we spoke to is that El Salvador was a violent place before these guys arrived. And when we were in the prisons themselves, some of the leaders said, look, man, The way we dress, the way we talk, the style, that's from LA. But the violence, that's from here. That was already here. We didn't have to do anything to get these guys. These guys, once they joined the gang, they were ready to kill because they learned it from here. They lived through the war. They saw the government come in and kill somebody in their village and then see their fathers organized to go back against the government. So yeah, we came down here and we gave them identity. We gave them something to fight for when they didn't have anything. So they, in a sense, it's kind of a weird way of saying that the gangs filled a void that hadn't been taken care of, and that's kind of looking back at what I was saying earlier about the issue of the disarmament and reintegration and how you actually have to look at that and actually address the facts that led to the war in the first place. As time progressed in the early 2000s, you had a thing called Moderator. And actually, let me backtrack. Around the time in the mid-90s, when they started realizing who these guys were, that's when you started seeing the death squads reactivated. The death squads that were active during the war now were reactivated and targeting the young men who were getting deported. So what do you think happens when the young men who have been deported realize that the death squads are coming after them? They all start hightailing back over here. And then the death squads aren't just going after the deportees, but they're going after anybody who's in a gang. So then you have a push factor of guys down there who are saying, wow, we gotta get out of here. So they start coming up. First wave hits Los Angeles, and the first wave of guys who arrive there are coming from Central America and saying, hey, I'm from MS, I'm from 18, and the guys from LA are saying, no, you're not. We gotta jump you in. We're MS, we're 18. So first wave hits LA, and they realize real quick, man, we don't want to go through the same thing in LA that we went through in El Salvador. I got jumped in El Salvador. Well, I got to get jumped in LA again. So you had that actually push them to other parts of the diaspora, and the word got out, and guys started going. And generally, people are going to go where their families are at. So there was no mechanism in the first place between the government and this government and the governments down there to let them know that they were coming. There was nothing set in place to reintegrate them. There was no any kind of reentry services. There was nothing to deal to kind of ease the tension that was going to be created by having these guys arrive in this country at that time. And I think one of the problems to date, that is still one of the problems to date. So you had that second wave of people coming, who were, some of them who were people who had gotten involved in the gangs who were coming back fleeing the violence that they were being targeted. You come into the 2000s, Moderator comes in. Moderator is Iron Fist. It's an extreme version of zero tolerance that was pushed from this country to the governments down there. They start a whole process of gang sweeps where they come in and these, similar to what happens in these neighborhoods, but at a higher level, where they come in and just pick up everybody on the street that is from any young man that's hanging out on the street, sweep them up, throw them in prison, and then sort it out afterwards. So imagine if you're some kid who just happened to be running to the store to get milk, or pupusas, or whatever you're running to the store to get in El Salvador, and a sweep comes in, and the next thing you know, you find yourself in a prison. And at that time, El Salvador had, and Central America, well, not Central America, Honduras and Guatemala. This is not a problem in Nicaragua. This is not a problem in Costa Rica. Interestingly enough, Nicaragua is the poorest country in Central America, but they don't have this problem. So that could be a whole other discussion. But suddenly you go to the prisons, and when we visited the prisons, and it was very interesting. You see these pictures that they show you of these guys all tatted up, their whole face, their whole head, their whole arm. And that's true. We went in the prisons and we saw that. But one of the things that struck me is a lot of the guys that had the craziest tattoos, they're all over them, were also some of the younger looking guys. They didn't have all the scars on them. They didn't, and that's not to say that they weren't involved in the gang or anything like that, but you could definitely see is you get stuck in a sweep and you get thrown in a jail in El Salvador, and you got a 6 month to a year before your case, they're even going to review why you're in there in the first place. That's a lot of time to sit in a prison with a bunch of guys in a gang. So if you weren't a gang member before you went in, you were pretty soon after that. So that whole concept, that went on. And another thing that happened with Moderator is it helped the gangs really organize. The gangs were segregated by by sets and whatnot, and it allowed them the opportunity to actually consolidate. So that's the situation now. We're looking at when you're deporting guys down to Central America now. That's still the situation. there is nothing set for them. A lot of them are now coming to situations where they don't have families, or if they do have families, they don't want to accept them. Because you do not want somebody coming from LA who's just been deported for a crime. And now we have a situation where, you know, it kind of stands right now as whose fault is it? Whose problem is it? The U.S. government is deporting them. The governments down there have asked in 2009, I believe, they asked the government, please stop deporting these guys, because there's no access to receive them. And now we're in a situation where we're seeing a large number of Central American youth. I think, and I'm going to leave it at this point, immigration to this country has dropped since 2008, I believe, with the exception of young people coming from the 3 Central American countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And also we're seeing a spike in unaccompanied minors coming to this country. And what are they coming from now is they're fleeing the high rates of violence in Central America. So I'll leave it at that. We could address more of the questions. Thank you.
The third speaker is Bernard Headley. Bernard is Professor Emeritus at University of West Indies, on the campus in Jamaica. Professor retired in May 2012. He had been Professor of Criminology from the Department of Sociology, Psychology and Social Work at the UWI Modern Jamaica. Bernard was educated in the United States, earning a PhD in Sociology from Howard University in 1982. Later became Professor of Sociology and Justice Studies for 20 years at the Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago. Twice awarded the Senior Fulbright Scholar. He returned to his native Jamaica in 2001 to assist with care of his elderly parents and set up a research and teaching position at UWI. Following that, Bernard was one of the first in Jamaica, one of the few Caribbean scholars to take an interest in this extraordinary expulsion of Jamaicans from the United States and Britain back to their supposed home. Let's welcome Bernard Headley.
Thank you very much, Dave. Please try to go back to your first slide here. First let me just thank David very much for doing this conference. This is probably the second one you've done here on campus, and you've invited me to. And it's great work, and it's also extremely great privilege to be here with a colleague whose work I've admired over the years, certainly over the last 4 or 5 years, at Kanstroom, and meeting you, Steve. Wonderful hearing, you know, the differences in really what happens in this deportation phenomenon, deportation story. As it happens, as it unfolds in Central America, there's some commonalities, but in truth and in fact quite different from what we have in the Caribbean and certainly in Jamaica. I also need, before I start, to acknowledge, you know, the presence of some Jamaicans here, some former students. I see Capri and Dad, stepdad here. Miss Viv, you know, these Jamaican folks here in New York in the struggle, and doing very well, We're proud of our Jamaicans who go abroad and do very well. And again, thank you, Dave, for taking good care of the students we send out. We're trying to send the best. We do send the best, and they excel. As you see there, I'm using your term, Kanstroom, the American diaspora. And our diaspora in Jamaica is, our deported diaspora in Jamaica is binational. So it's not just Americans who are Jamaican Americans or Jamaicans who lived in the United States and got deported, but we're also talking Jamaicans who live in Britain, significant number, and then get deported. There are also Jamaicans who lived in Canada and get deported, but those are much smaller numbers. So of the, probably since 2000, starting in 2000 thereabouts, we've had probably altogether about 40,000 more people deported, Jamaicans deported and back into Jamaica. I'd say safely about 45,000. A vast number, probably 80%, do come from the United States, maybe another 20, probably, let's be fair now. Let's be fair. These numbers, of course, have changed. But I think on the ground now, it's hard to get pinned on these numbers, but on the ground now, probably 60% of the people who are deported have come from the United States, maybe another 30-35% from Great Britain, and probably 5% from Canada, a very small number from Canada. You will notice that I've described, the motives were that were to talk about what happens to the deported in the countries which they are deported. I have used these terms to describe what we see as what happens to the deported. What are their attitudes, what are the mental states, what are their frames of references. It runs the whole gamut. It ranges from being desperate. And you talk to deported people, and they're desperate, and they will say, look, I'll do anything to survive. I am at the point where, you know, I am so desperate. Anything that it takes to make a living, I will do. You also run into some deported people who are dispirited, broken, not ready to commit suicide, but have entertained the thought many times. But we have no statistics, so to speak, of deported people having actually committed suicide. But in many ways, the spirit is broken, a goodly number. They are potentially dangerous. We have no statistic, again, supporting the notion deported people are adding to Jamaica's crime problem. It's one of the myths that the police cling to dearly, you know, and we've been working, trying to get the police to see otherwise, to produce the evidence if you have that kind of evidence, and they do not. They have consistently been unable to. The work that we do clearly shows, you know, among the people that we work with, and certainly it's a good number, that over the years we have not seen them get involved in criminal activity. So they're potentially dangerous. The longer you keep people, of course, homeless, these separated, truncated families because of deportation. One of them that, and this young lady knows you, by the way, her name is Teresa, from Cleveland, you know. And she wrote me some years ago to say, Professor Headley, my husband, you know, has been, you know, whatever might have been his petty offense that got elevated to a major felony, you know, and because it was now a major felony, he got deported. And she was just simply so distraught, you know, have a small child, and he's just taken away, you know, did some time, and she thought that after having done his 4 or 5 years in prison, he was going to come back home, all had been forgiven, and he was going to get on with his life. But coming out of prison, immigration authorities, ICE, was waiting for him, sent him down to Jamaica. And she wanted to know if there's any way that we could reach out to him. So I did. I got Errol and got him to class, got him up to class on campus, and he talked to the students and talked to his wife on the phone. And here's a letter that she sent me when I told her about this conference. My family continues to do the best we can with our situation. Errol still has it pretty rough, but manages to get along. He had an accident this summer, fell out of a tree, which left him with several broken ribs and a head injury. It was difficult to get information and was emotionally hard not being able to care for him, but he is recovering. Our son, and that's our son in Ohio, her son and Errol's son, he's now 8 years old, and it's been 6 years since Errol has physically seen him. He's an excellent student and quite an athlete. He speaks to his father almost every day, and we send lots of pictures. There are hundreds and thousands of stories like that about the separation. Primarily we're talking about fathers, Jamaican, Caribbean, West Indian fathers being separated from their American-born children, you know, small children who then grew up, you know, in these truncated, separated homes. Let me go back to the last of my meta-narrative. Deportation is a tragedy of the displaced. It is having now to forge new identities, the displaced, the deported, having now to forge new identities and construct new diaspora communities. So, as I said, in Jamaica we have this diaspora community of our Jamaican brethren who have done 10, 20, 50, well, 10, 20, 30 years in America, and now in this community forging a new kind of identity. Let me just, I snapped a few statistics from out of my work here to show you what happens to Jamaica. The number, this is the total criminal deportation from the United States to the Caribbean. And the Caribbean we're talking about essentially the English-speaking Caribbean mostly, but also including the DR and Haiti. So you see where we started, so from under 3,000 in late 1994 to 2005, that's still some years ago, to the Caribbean receiving upwards of 5,166 criminal convicted deportees. This is the way they break in terms of from Jamaica, deported from UK and the US. The US is the sort of grayish in the chart. UK is the light, so they're almost neck and neck. Canada is in total black. And you see how low those numbers are. You will see at some years, certainly in 2004, there were certainly more deported people, more deported migrants coming to Jamaica from the UK than from the US. I'll quickly go through some of these. Here's an interesting statistic. Per 100,000 population, we compare here Jamaica, the Bahamas, Dominican Republic, and Trinidad and Tobago, Cuba, and Haiti. That is the deported population to the rest of the population. The ratio of deported people to the rest of the population runs this high in Jamaica. For every 100,000 people in Jamaica, 61 of them are deported. Why does it keep jumping faster? 61 have been deported. In the Bahamas, again, these are US deported people. In the Bahamas compared, that's 32 per 100,000, and you will see even though Dominican Republic, has raw numbers, large raw numbers, probably the largest in terms of aggregate numbers of deported going to the Dominican Republic, yet on a ratio basis, they're only like 29. Why the numbers, as I'm saying, don't support the notion, the idea, the hypothesis, the myth of deported people being involved in crime in Jamaica. And here's why. Here's one of the reasons. There's a dominant reason. The age at which they get returned to Jamaica is well into adulthood, right? That's what you find also, right? The largest percentage, which is like somewhere around, close to 23-25% of deported people come back in their late 30s, right? So that's the single largest population. Somewhere in the late 30s to early 40s, that's where it clumps up around people coming back, the people we meet. By the way, this is the way it works, The United States sends back every Thursday. Every Thursday, my representative from my organization and another organization will go to meet the deported people coming back from the United States in Kingston. And it's a chartered flight that they come on. So every Thursday there's about 80 coming into Kingston. So every month there's about 80. So there's close to 2,000 who still come every year from the United States. Britain is probably much less than that. Coming from Britain is probably in the region of 8 to 10 per week. If you see an association here between violent crime, between homicide, for example, and deported people coming back, you tell me. Just simply, charting the movement of the two things that are occurring. We could even make a false conclusion that if two things are moving in the same direction, there must be some association, right? And statistical window doesn't really work like that. But you have at least some basis, some sort of minimum rationale if they're moving in the same direction. But here it is. You will see in 1 year, 2003, murder rate went up, and the deported population went down, right? So what kind of relationship is there? They may from time to time move in the same direction, but by and large, they're really moving in opposite directions. Bearing all this in mind, we in the summer of 2009, 2010, we got a little grant from the UNDP, European Union, to locate people who were deported in the Kingston area, bring them together in a workshop so that we could define the commonality of the problem and where do we go from here? What are the things that face you as a deported person in this country, that really bothers you? And really, how can we organize to go from here? You can either accept, and one of the things that you asked us for in presenting, David, is the deported people who want to go back to the country that deported them. Any indication that you have of how many want to go back? And I was talking to a couple of my people just and hearing that particular question. And the answer is as much as 80%, 8 out of 10, have in their head somewhere an inclination, a desire, and perhaps it's natural to go back, especially if you have family, right? So let's not delude ourselves that they don't want to come back and are ready to formalize in Jamaica. That's not the case. What we'll try to say is, brethren, there are some harsh realities here. Getting back to America, despite the work of Dan Kanstroom and the advocacy work that's going on in the United States, and the human rights advocacy, is going to be very challenging making it back into that country, whether the UK or to the US. So we encourage folks to think, if it's even for the short term, let us say you're going to go back in 5 or 10 years, but even for the short term, even in the meantime, what would you like to do with your life? Are there things that we can organize to do with your lives? Let's see. All right. So what are the problems that you face in this country? And what kind of recommendations would you like for us to take to government? One of the things that kept coming up is that, we don't like the way that we're greeted in this country, we don't like the way that we're received. We're greeted by armed policemen. We are typecast in this country. We're interrogated about tattoos by the law enforcement officials. They want to know exactly which community are you going to reside in, because depending on the community that you say you're going to reside in, it gives them an indication of whether or not you're going to go and commit crime, or what kind of associations are you likely to have back in Jamaica. There's constant harassment and intimidation that deported people receive in their home country. They are always the recipients of threats by the police officers. And so whenever there is a crime in a community, and it's, a deported people or a deported person lives in that community, the first person of interest generally is the deported person. So in our discussion, we asked, what is it that we can make of ourselves? What is it that the deported community can make of ourselves? And over several intense workshops, deciding to call themselves deported migrants. One of the things that came out is that what we can do, we can be, and this is a verse of scripture, we can even though we were rejected cornerstones, yet coming back home, maybe we can be a chief cornerstone. I picked up this quote from David, that there is the possibility, and we talked about the possibility of our men and women coming back being transformed, the new mindsets, and there is this possibility, there is the desire, after much discussion and discourse, that maybe we can become our own movement, and that's what the organization ends up being. Because one has to remember, deported people are part of a thrice rejected community. They were really rejected and castaways when they first had to migrate, Then they migrated to New York and they become part of a surplus population that got gobbled up in a Jim Crow system of mass incarceration. And then they come back to Jamaica, where they are regarded as ex-prisoners, and on top of it, worst of all, are regarded as deportees. So what we wanted was we wanted a better understanding of what happened to our situation. What is it that happened in America? An explanation, for example, of the 1996 law and its effect on us, effect of its relationship to why we're back here. To survive in Jamaica, we need housing. We need both emergency, immediate housing, as well as permanent, sustainable housing. and we need employment. We need a sustainable skill. So one of the things that came out, or the important thing that came out of those workshop meetings, was this organization, National Organization of the Deported Migrants, and I have some literature here, and we have a website, which I'll encourage you to go to and see what it is about. I'm leaving a DVD with David that, again, the British assisted us in preparing, which tells us exactly, which describes more in detail what that organization does. But it's organized for respect. It's insisting on a seat at the table. We want to talk, when the Ministry of National Security wants to make plans about how to receive and what to do about quote-unquote deportees, we want to be in on the discussion, and they are in on those discussions. We want mutual respect and collaboration, which is what they are getting, and to their honor, from the British High Commission, not yet from the Americans, not yet from the American Embassy. There's still a standoff here, but they are receiving tremendous amount of collaborative respect from the British High Commission. Part of the work, again funded by the British High Commission, is transporting deported people as they're coming from Britain. Finding immediate shelter for deported persons. Deported persons come, by and large, without any place really to stay, probably 50–60% on that very night. Land in Kingston or land in Montego Bay, don't know where they're going to go that very night. Our people, deported migrants, NODM as it's called, part of their remit is to make sure that when I meet someone coming in from Britain, that they have a place to stay that night. Some, of course, will say they have family, and so we take them to family, or anywhere it is in the island, and then assist them with documentation. You come back to Jamaica as a deportee, you only come with a scandal bag, you have really no name, you have to start your process of being identified all over again, including getting a birth certificate, you have to go to JPs, dishonest JPs in some instances who charge you an arm and a leg just for, to authorize your signature. So we find that there's a need for simple documentation, identification documentation, which we're helping with. We try to refer people to job training possibilities, and we have the big dream of starting industries and agriculture, industries in agriculture and other kinds of industries that are managed, owned, profit shared by deported people. Big dreams, Let me just read you very quickly an interesting note from one of our men, pick up the deported people coming in from Britain. Just Sunday night, this is what Glenn wrote. We arrived at Montego Bay around 5 p.m. to meet charter arriving at 4:30. And as is our custom, we alerted NIB, that's the police department, of our presence. Mr. Simpson was confirmed to have arrived. Mr. Simpson was coming from Britain. However, we could not verify that he needed transportation. We later found out that he would be traveling to Yadas in St. Thomas from Montego Bay. Mr. Simpson, age 65. This is not the man who's going to come to Jamaica and be again. 65 years old, he was escorted out, and we greeted him and then welcomed him. Important function of our organization is making you feel welcoming back home. We wasted no time, as we had far to go. We set sail into tonight from Mr. Simpson's destination is all the way in St. Thomas. Now we're hoping that Mr. Simpson's daughter, here's the problem, will collaborate with him, will tide him over until he reaches a point where he can stand on his own. That has not been the case. That is not the normal case when deported people come back to family. Family will, entertain you for probably 2 to 3 weeks, or at longest a month, until they find out that you have nothing and you have no means of support, and then they ask you to leave. That's when they become homeless, and that's really when they become potentially dangerous. I said it's time, and I just have 3 more slides here. New bridges. Then we tell deported people or deported migrants that, if you have a claim on the United States government that you should be back and that you should never be deported, fight that claim. We, see the people up in Boston who can assist you with that, and the big name lawyers like Kanstroom, who can, assist you with your human rights case. And the same thing is true in Great Britain. Great Britain has the incentive of offering, if you just go straight down, man, just go straight home, You know, we'll give you some money so you can start life. Don't fight your case. And there's a facilitated response scheme in which we'll give you, I think the figure is around £1,500. That you just go home and use this £1,500 and start life. But don't fight your case. Our people have not been jumping overboard for that, right? Because they feel they have a case to make. In many cases, they have a case to make. So we say, if you have a case, a justifiable human rights case, or you feel there's a defensible case that you have against them kicking you out, then do your case. Pursue it by all means. But if somehow you see that you can make life in Jamaica, if you're still somewhere around 35, 40 years old, and you see that there's a possibility of finding a niche in the society, of making a contribution into the society, we will try to break down the walls of prejudice. It's our job as educators, as students at the university and so on, as educators, to do the informing and to spread the knowledge and try to break down the walls of prejudice, whatever that takes. But if you have a determination to make a go of life in Jamaica, regardless of that status or regardless of what happened to you, let us see if we can build on it. So we talk about industries and we talk about getting into agriculture, getting into farming. So over the last season, less than a year now, we've had this notion of doing Irish potato farming with our deported men. And Capri has been down there and saw the site we were holding at the time. It was still green at that time, right? In Jamaica, we have a custom of capturing land, So I captured this bit of land from my friend in the United States who has really no direct plans to come back to Jamaica to build his dream house. So on the spot of this dream house, this large spot of this dream house, we decided we'd do some Irish potato farming and have about half a dozen or so deported men working in. So that's what an Irish potato field, that's what the field looked like after we just plowed it and they're now planting. Deeply engaged in planting Irish potatoes, and we had a bumper crop, not a lot of acreage, but on an experimental pilot basis, we're able to, the Ministry of Agriculture tells us that the country spends over $100 million a year, in its food import bill. And a large percentage of that food import bill is paying for Irish potatoes. And we have great soil in Jamaica that grows the largest Irish potatoes you will ever see, in Manchester in particular. So here you see we're deep down, and here's a deportee to the right. You don't recognize that deportee with the leaning on the hole. Right? And this is what it looks like after 2 or 3 months, and we really didn't get a picture of the harvesting. But under that little plot, we harvested 3,000 pounds of Irish potato, sold it, cleared expenses, and put some more deported men saw a living wage. And we want to expand on that. We want to go bigger on that. That's the end of it. All right, so those are some of the plans. We have plans for recycling and so on. But the idea is, if you want to be part of the rock, you can make a contribution part of the rock, despite the way in which you came back home. All right, thank you.
Great, so we've got about 20-25 minutes left for questions. I think we're just going to take the questions straight from the audience, for comments or
Before we do that, I was very moved by this presentation, and also want to point out to you that 2 things, actually 3 things. One is there are none of this level of sophistication in an organization that I know, but there are other organizations doing this around the world. It's quite an interesting movement if you start thinking about it and looking at it from a global perspective. There's a sort of new sense of identity that is developing all over the world of, we can stop calling them deportation, call them forcibly expelled, maybe sometimes I use that term. But I have experienced this in Cambodia, in Haiti, in Guatemala, in El Salvador. There are groups like this that are starting to coalesce a little bit. In the Azores, which is a place you all may not know too much about, but we have a lot of deportees from there, the Portuguese who came to Massachusetts. There's a community of people. And so it really is a movement in a lot of different places. It's quite interesting. The other thing, though, is that when you urge people to fight their deportation cases, which I often will do, one of the big problems is that part of the 96 laws was mandatory detention. So a lot of people who actually have defenses find that it's so demoralizing to stay in this country in immigration detention that they just give up. And that's why they then contact our project after having been deported, and then we have to try to bring them back. But we are successful. We actually, I was telling David, we just brought somebody back from the Dominican Republic 2 weeks ago in Boston because it turned out that he had been convicted for one single offense of possession of cocaine. He had been a lawful permanent resident for, I think, 12 years. But the state crime chemist who had done the lab certification actually had forged the results, not only in his case, but in thousands of cases, and she has since been indicted herself. So we combined with the Harvard Criminal Clinic, got his conviction vacated, and actually brought him back to JFK Airport a couple of weeks ago. So it is possible, actually, after the fact. And there's one other thing I want to say, which is that we are undertaking a project at Boston College to create an international convention on the rights of the forcibly expelled. This idea of being a refugee is very interesting because it was a category that was created in a particular historical period, roughly starting in the 1930s, and then comes to fruition after the Second World War. The idea that certain people have certain special needs and therefore should have certain special rights not to be deported. I think we're at a point now globally where the forcibly expelled are such a group because this mechanism, and there's another meta-narrative, I think, which is that this, as I was intimating before, that this is a racialized response of power by majority populations and by the West generally to get rid of surplus labor. I mean, there's more we can say about that. But these people have a lot more in common than differentiates them. And we are proposing certain just basic rights. The right to have a short-term visa to visit your children, for example. The right to have access to the legal system of the country that deported you in order to raise claims that you were wrongly deported. The right to your Social Security, that's a big issue. A lot of these people have earned money in the U.S. system that is then taken from them and they never see it again, et cetera. So I just wanted to highlight that. Stay tuned because we're convening a big conference on this in May. In fact, you're invited. I'll talk to you more about it.
Great, yeah. So no, Lucia, and then you, sorry, Lucia. Oh, look, you. Sorry.
We need to use the microphone, sorry.
Okay.
Hi, I know you briefly touched upon this in your presentation, but fighting the court of the American public opinion, I think, is going to be one of the toughest challenges, because as we find, it's even hard to get basic rights for prisoners and formerly incarcerated people who are citizens of this country. So in that aspect, what have you seen or experienced as you try to advocate for people who aren't even American citizens in your work?
Well, first of all, it is definitely an uphill climb because you're fighting against a number of different things. And one of the most pernicious of those things is actually something that this current administration has gravitated towards, which is the idea that these are the bad ones. So in addition to all the other things, that they're young men of color, that they tend to be poor people, all those sorts of things, you have that too. And so that narrative is particularly tough. I'm heartened by the fact that if we were having this symposium 5 years ago, we would even be asking the same question about the dreamers, about the good ones. There's been a dramatic change in consciousness in this country already about the harm that the deportation system is doing and about how it's been a process over a period of time that has affected a lot of people disproportionately. So I tend to focus on proportionality more than ultimate good or bad. It's a matter of, not to say that people didn't do wrong, but they have paid their debt to the criminal justice system already. That's an important thing. They've already done whatever time they need to do, and now this is a double punishment. This is an extra sanction, and it's disproportionately harsh. So that's how I tend to couch it. We also have just a lot of personal stories of people who have experienced this, and I think it is starting to get out there. I mean, it started to get out there regarding the criminal justice system. It took a good long time, not only through the Innocence Project, but things like, why are people doing 25-year sentences for simple possession of drugs in the state of New York, the Rockefeller drug laws and all that. But I think it's turned, I think there's been a lot of changes, so I just keep, I tell my students, we're just chipping away at the walls little by little. And also, we tend to do things in court. And sometimes that can actually have a change in consciousness when you can get a judge to say, yes, actually, now that I think about it differently, this person probably does have rights. And maybe we should take their claims a little more seriously. But it's a struggle. It's true.
Yeah, Lucia.
So I have two questions for anybody who's interested in responding. The first is, can somebody say more about the difference between formal deportation and removal and what that means in practice? And then my second question is there any discussion about the right to defense attorneys or a right to an attorney? Is that discourse changed at all? Is there any movement on it? And where does that stand?
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is actually what I'm doing these days, so I can tell you a lot about that. First of all, removal is a catch-all category that basically means one of any number, there are dozens actually of different mechanisms that could remove a person from the United States. Formal deportation hearings, which are actually now technically known as formal removal hearings, are one of those mechanisms that apply to certain types of people. Basically, people who have been legally admitted to the United States and are being deported because of some conduct that they did. It could be criminal, but it's not only criminal. There are people who are deported for having donated money to Hamas. There are political things going on here too. Or that got married and then somebody says it was a fraudulent marriage. There's a lot of different types of things. But that's the 300,000 to 400,000 are the formal removals that take place in courts with immigration judges. Now those are not like a criminal trial. They're less formal than that, but there is some formality. But one thing those people don't have, so some of those other mechanisms are really informal. Like if you get caught in this zone in the southwestern part of the United States and you look Latino, you could be on a fast track out in a day or two. It's called expedited removal. No judge, no hearing, no nothing. And there's a lot of those it's too complicated to get into in detail, but those have been invented more and more to move people really fast without access to the legal system at all. There's hundreds of thousands of cases like that all the time. But those are supposed to only apply to people who are undocumented and who have been here for a relatively short period of time. On the other hand, we've seen U.S. citizens who have been deported by mistake because the government doesn't ask the right questions. Now about lawyers, this is a big thing. People who have lawyers, there's been really good data on this, there have been studies now, have a dramatically better chance of not being deported. There are defenses that good lawyers can bring. The numbers are staggering. And yet, unfortunately, you have no right to a lawyer. So if you get arrested for trespassing or any minor offense, you have the right to a lawyer. But if you're facing banishment from this country for the rest of your life, you have no right to a lawyer. So this is a big thing. And there was a case 3 years ago now at the U.S. Supreme Court called Bettina versus Kentucky, in which the court actually for the first time held that a criminal defense lawyer has the professional obligation and responsibility to advise a person before you take a plea. Let me just tell you, if you take this plea, you might get a good deal in the criminal system, which a lot of people do, but then you're going to get deported. Because a lot of criminal lawyers make big mistakes on this. They say, well, take the deal, you'll be fine. And then we get the call from Honduras or Jamaica, what happened. So the court now said that those people have that right, and actually, if the lawyer messes up like that, you can reopen the case. So there's been a tremendous initiative in New York now to provide more lawyers for people. And even in Massachusetts, we're seeing more training of lawyers. I'm actually doing a lot of training of criminal defense lawyers. I used to be a criminal defense lawyer and taught criminal law also, so it's sort of easier for me. And state courts are upholding these rules too. So the Massachusetts court just issued a very important decision that said Padilla is now retroactive in Massachusetts. So people who took pleas as far back as 1997 reopen their cases. So we're needing efforts. I'm actually doing training next week on this to get public defenders to take these cases. So I think that's also part of an answer to the first question of how work in the legal system can actually change consciousness over time.
So just in terms of this initiative, just to let folks know, Judge Robert Katzman is coming on December 9th, and he is sorry, I'm getting the date wrong, but he is coming to speak as part of the Immigration and Deportation Initiative here at John Jay, December 4th. He is the Chief Justice of the Southern District of New York.
No, Second Circuit.
Second Circuit, okay. I'm getting all my facts wrong here. But he is certainly one of the people who's at the center of that initiative to expand representation for immigrants facing deportation hearings here in New York. So just if you're interested, please do come to that event.
Yeah, let me just give him a shout out publicly. He has done incredible work as a judge, and there's a lot of judges who don't want to be bothered with this. But he is not only bothered, he's gone way out of his way to try to reform the system. So that's a very good.
Yeah.
Actually, I had a few questions for you, Mr. Kanstroom. Yeah. So you mentioned that lawful permanent residents face deportation. Is that also true of naturalized citizens? Do they do not face deportation at all?
Not unless they get denaturalized, which is it's very hard for the government to do that. They do it. They've done it to some old Nazis, and they do it to people who maybe fraudulently obtain their citizenship, but that's pretty rare.
Okay.
And then they have to be deported after that.
Okay, and then I guess for the entire panel, folks have mentioned the 96 laws, and you specifically mentioned, McVeigh as something that might have been a catalyst to sort of push those through, but obviously those were things that folks were thinking about before that time. I don't know if maybe I missed it, sort of what led to the to folks wanting to pass these laws. Did the first bombing of the World Trade Center in '93 have anything to do with that? And sort of now that things are already sort of in motion, aside from sort of political momentum, is there also economic momentum? For example, a lot of prisons were built, and a lot of people say that part of the reasons that there were high rates of incarceration was to sort of feed this prison industrial complex. And is there a similar phenomenon with respect to immigration?
Yeah, there's big private money actually in the immigration detention business. Do you want to talk about that? About 96, I would just say, first of all, part of the motivation was prosecutors and INS, it wasn't called ICE until 2003, but who had felt that they were not deporting enough people. So that there was a sort of ideological cohort in Washington. And there were some prominent senators and congressmen who led the charge on this. But I think the bigger narrative, the bigger story, is what I said before. I think it goes back to the 1980s. It goes back to the first legalization deal that was made in 1986. The people, conservatives in particular, and particularly conservatives in the South, in the Southwest, were very uncomfortable with this and felt this was 1986, and felt that 4 million people did get legalized during that law. And the deal was supposedly, according to Alan Simpson, that then the border would be closed. There would be no more undocumented immigration. And people saw these young men continue to come across the southern border for various reasons. So that led to a kind of backlash. Now, I happen to think that there's a core of racial anxiety in that backlash, and it's very analogous to depriving young African-American men of the right to vote, which was also happening at the same time, thereby, in effect, transforming them into non-citizens in interesting ways, taking away the core privilege of citizenship. So I think these things have to be seen together, and I think it really has its roots in the 70s, and then, but more specifically in the 80s when that happened. And then it was just a matter of finding the right vehicle and changing the laws. So the pressure was building. Yeah, Oklahoma City was an excuse. It obviously had nothing to do with it.
That was riots as well. The thing that happened after 1992 was California took that step to start. Excuse me. California took that step after the riots in LA, and it was clear that if you understood the politics of California at that time, California was kind of the forefront of, I guess you could say, the racial politics in this country. There was a lot of discussion that California was about to become a majority-minority state. It wasn't just, there was a series of things that happened. It wasn't, I think the riots were a good excuse in terms of looking at the deportations, but then you have to look at some of the legislation that came in California following that, in terms of 187, the anti-immigration bill, and 209 was affirmative action. So there was, and I'm not an expert on that. I'm just speaking from just the larger political context of the state I was living in at the time. So I think these gentlemen might be able to answer that in terms of the immigration laws at the national level and everything. But I think you have to look at that, and that was something that, along, especially in the Southwest, that was a big concern. You're seeing this population that was rising, not just Latinos in California, it's Asians as well. You know, so it's, you know, there was, you know, then depending on what part of the country you're in, that's the people that were being targeted.
Just to finish up on that, because I strongly subscribe to the notion that Stanley Cohen uses the term moral panic, that there's a degree of moral panic certainly in Europe and the United States when it comes to scapegoating and finding others to blame for the problems and the issues facing society and crime, of course. So we need a scapegoat, and it has turned out to be people of color. I also make the argument, and I think there's strong support for it in the data that we're looking at, that deportation coming at the time that it did was certainly also a part of an answer to the problem of prison overcrowding. What do we do with all these, you know, these bulging prisons that are costing so much, you know, and looking inside the prisons and seeing that in fact they are these nationals who, you know, American people should not be asked to keep in prisons. So we take them out of prisons and, you know, and ship them home. That is certainly very true. The British don't make any pretense about making that argument, that our prisons are filled with Nigerians and Jamaicans and other West Indians and Africans. And there is a concerted thrust to remove, you know, take out of prisons those who are not of us. And so we can have more space to probably put in more of us.
Of course, you know, there's another irony, speaking of economics. Here's something that's true in both El Salvador, but I saw it in Guatemala. When I was driving through Guatemala with somebody, and I tell the story in the book, actually, and I'm wondering, are there any jobs, these deportees, you know, these evildoers that we have to get rid of, what do they do when they get to Guatemala? A lot of them don't speak Spanish, you know, they only speak English, so what do they do? He points to a big building there, he said, that's where they are, they're all working in there. What is that? It's a credit card call center. So, like, when you're giving your social security number to the guy you're talking to on the phone, it could be a deportee, you know. So that's just one of the ironies I can tell you.
Hi, good evening. So I think this question might be for Dan, but anyone else who's fit to answer it. So at the grassroots level, a lot of young activists have actually organized around the issue of deportation. A lot of them have kind of designed petition letters that many of us may have already received every single day. They do phone banking and have even like defied immigration law by self-deporting and then asking to return to the country. My first question is, how effective are those strategies? Do they actually work? And then my second question is, what do you feel about the, I guess, recent proposal about giving deferred action to everyone as an alternative to the immigration reform proposal, given that it's really not going anywhere, at least this year? Is that an actual reality? I know President Obama has said that it's really not possible to give deferred action to every undocumented immigrant in the country, but there is, you know, recent conversation about it, so I think it's important to kind of note it tonight.
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm just so moved by the picture of the young activists who are doing this work that I can't even talk about it sometimes, because the courage that they show, the self-awareness and the energy is just remarkable. I mean, it's really impressive, and they are facing really tough odds. Having said that, some of the strategies strike me as really dangerous too. I mean, there are people who go down to the border and say, take me, I'm undocumented. And I don't know if they realize the consequences of what they might be doing there, because some of those cases are just, they're going to be deported, a lot of it, and they may never get back. So that worries me a little bit, but you know, it's hard to judge other people's tactics, particularly when they're suffering the way a lot of these people. And I do think actually, as I said earlier, that there has been a change in consciousness. And frankly, I think if the Affordable Care Act website had actually worked, we might have had a better chance of getting something through the Congress, although none of the proposals that I've seen deal with the issues that we've been talking about here. And that's true of deferred action as well. It will not apply to those who are facing deportation because of criminal conduct. I don't think anybody's talking about lightening the load on that group. Now, that's not to say that the other group, I mean, there's millions of people who benefit from that deferred action proposal. So I I supported. In fact, I've signed on to letters and worked on memoranda that were given to people in the administration to explain why the president does have the authority to do this. It's not illegal, the executive branch can do it. So I think it's okay, but I'm just bitterly disappointed in this administration. I worked on some of the transition team initiatives along with a lot of other people. We thought, I was in Guatemala, in fact, when Barack Obama was running for president. I remember telling young men in Guatemala, you know, we've got this guy who's running, it'll be amazing if he wins, but particularly for immigrants, you know, I just think he's got the consciousness. He obviously knows what's going on. And yet the number of deportations in this administration is higher than it was in the Bush administration. So we just have to call them on that. I mean, even if they are, some of them, you know, our friends. But it's quite demoralizing because, as you said, I think right now it doesn't look like much is going to get through the legislature. And, you know, we're just this close to lame duck status with this administration. So it's hard to be honest.
Yeah.
So, as an immigrant, I knew that my key goal is to get education. And all of you mentioned that there's a lot of youth that get stuck in this spiral of deportation. So what happens with their education as a young person? I think that's something very important. I heard that you guys, the farming, you employ them and everything, but for the young people, I think if they're educated, there's a better chance that they can take a stand for themselves, or they know better of what's going to happen. For example, I'm sitting here, I didn't know all this. I'm educating myself as an immigrant that all this can happen anytime, maybe in my future to me or anybody in my family, right? So how, is there a system, or if there are programs that are helping the young that get deported, and what happens, because they get stuck in that immigration cycle, what happens with their education? Does that put that aside, or is it not considered important?
I mean, I dealt with a pretty specific population. Many of them who didn't necessarily have the best options for education when they were in this country as well. In the context of getting down to Central America, and again, I'll kind of refer to El Salvador, and there's not, you know, there's, when the issue that I'll give an example that's not necessarily related to education, but I think speaks a lot to what the situation is in some of the countries that people are finding, particularly for Central America. When we first initiated the idea of going for a delegation to investigate what was going on in the troops, I spoke with friends of mine in the State Department and USAID, and first thing that one of the people said is, look, don't come back and tell us that we need to help get jobs for these gang members down there, because we can't even get jobs for the kids in these neighborhoods in El Salvador that are doing good. You know, define whatever doing good is. And then also the context of the mano dura, the laws that have come through in Central America, it's in effect illegal to, if you've been identified as a gang member, and in the context of these countries, a lot of the people who have been deported, whether they are or not, a lot of times are viewed as being gang members because they were criminal deportees. You don't have access to public services. We sat with the Minister of Justice, and one of the things that he said was, you know, we've got a population of 60,000 people, and he's just talking about, he's not talking specifically about deportees, he's talking about people who the country's identified as gang members, who we effectively are outside the law. We do not, as a law, we don't provide services to them, and that also extends out to their families. So in the context of El Salvador, I think it's similar in Honduras and Guatemala. Just these kids are kind of locked. You know, the guys who are deported are somewhat locked out of the system, and then if they have family down there, and then other kids. I mean, it's not just deportees; it's also an effect of what happened with the extreme laws against crime.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and I'd like to talk about the situation is same identical in Jamaica in terms of the stigmatization, the marginalization. You can't get work because you're a deportee. You know, just finding doors blocked to you. But there are some success stories, and we have a student, one of our deported men, came registered to the University of the West Indies, and I was just so pleased. 25-year-old young man graduated when we had graduation last month. The other day I was shopping at what is our equivalent of Costco. It's called Price Mart on Belliers Road. And lo and behold, the person was writing up my order, I heard him with this, disjointed kind of American Jamaican accent, And immediately as I heard this disjointed Jamaican American accent, I said, that's one of my brethren, I'm sure that's it. And it turned out in our conversation, he was deported, but he is one of the managers at Costco, So there are these success stories, men who are determined enough to pick up the pieces, and struggle against all odds. And as a society, again, if we do our work as educators, to open the society and stop the stereotyping and the scapegoating, and just let some opportunities become available, that they will walk through those doors.
Also, let me say that we have a program through the Center for Human Rights at Boston College that I started with a colleague in Guatemala. It's like a satellite off-front storefront kind of a thing, where we actually have staff and we have an organizer. And it's a place where the people who have been deported can gather, they can get information, they can learn things, and they can get in touch with us as lawyers, but they can also get in touch. We can help them keep in touch with their families. And we do try to offer some educational possibilities for them, but it's just incredibly difficult to think about anything in an organized way. But I do think that it's something that American universities, it's actually a very exciting idea if you think about it. If students in this country were to think about organizing such projects to connect with those people and provide some resources, I think that might be something that people would gravitate towards. So I'm glad that you volunteered to start this project.
So it's something that could start a new revolution kind of a thing, right? To educate these people for their better futures.
And also help them to be connected to you and to the community here if they want to come back. The age of the cohort is important. If you're talking about 40, 50, 60-year-old men, it's a very different thing from when you're talking to about 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old men. And it's mostly men, although there are women who get deported too. In fact, non-trivial numbers of women. But I think focusing on the younger men might be the better strategy with a project like that. But you could focus certainly in El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Cambodia, actually. There's a lot of Cambodians, who grew up in Seattle and are still basically stuck in Cambodia. Sorry? California. Yeah, California too. And in Massachusetts.
One more after.
So along with the Immigration Deportation Initiative, John Jay launched its John Jay Dreamers Club this semester, and it's a place where we've been able to provide students a way to express their thoughts and opinions about immigration and deportation. As a member of the club, I know that some of the students, for the first time, they've been able to voice that they are indeed undocumented. So my question to the panel is, what advice would you give to these students facing these struggles and problems?
There was a famous labor activist named Joe Hill, who was the member of a group called the International Workers of the World. This is back in the late 19th, early 20th century. And his motto was, don't mourn, organize. And I think this goes back to a number of the questions. That my advice is that social solidarity is the most powerful thing that we have. And we have to organize amongst ourselves, not only the people who are undocumented, not only the people who have been deported, not only their families, but also the rest of us who care about the country, who care about justice and fairness. So that's one piece of advice. I think that's a wonderful initiative. We have similar things at Boston College, actually, where students are gravitating towards each other and trying to organize in that way. The second thing is, though, I would say, make sure you bring lawyers in every once in a while to help give people actually examine the particularities of their situations. And there are a lot of lawyers who will do this for nothing. They will just come in. We do know your rights presentations. We do them in prisons, but we also do them in schools. And we can help people. There may be ways through this for people that they're not aware of. We have found people who actually could naturalize. They didn't realize it, but we just had to naturalize their mother, and then the young person could actually get legal status. So there are plenty of things that can happen.
I'm going to pick up on that becoming a naturalized citizen theme, because that is critically important for particularly, and there's a mindset among us West Indian people, I know for sure, that we only see ourselves as coming into North America for a period, that North America could never really be my home. I know I lived in this country for almost 30 years and resisted the very thought of becoming an American citizen, because I always saw myself coming here to go to school, work some hours, and then go back home. And that this was not going to be my home. But you live here 30-odd years, that's pretty much home. And so we have generations of Jamaicans who come here and don't become citizens when you really ought to. And I think the work that Bettina is doing is really moving people in that to think differently. You are going to be here. So why not get all the benefits that you can anyway by becoming a citizen of this country? And you become a citizen of this country, they can't deport you. But there's, speaking, again, one looks at what our government is really not doing. And one of the things that our consulates need to be more active in is really when it comes to when a national, so these people who don't become American citizens, who are not naturalized. And they are really residents and visitors in this country, students in this country, and run into these kinds of legal difficulties in which they could potentially be deported. That our consulates need to be more active, need to be more activist in protecting the rights of their people who are living in this country. One of the things that really need to be said, and if you get arrested for simply one of our representatives say, don't say a word. The tendency is, if it's a small offense, to plead guilty, cop a plea, and then try to get on back with your life. Most dangerous thing you could do is to cop a plea, because copping that plea might, a felon, and you will become deported. So first thing that our residents should do is, of course, call your consulate, and we expect our Jamaican consulate to rush to the scene or send somebody there to say, here's what you do and do not do. And the first thing is just simply not plead guilty. All right.
I guess my advice would be that at this point, especially for the Dreamers, just echoing the sentiments over here, it's been a wonderful job that, the advocacy that the Dreamers have done for themselves, and the networks that continue to build, because that really, I think that's going to extend out to the larger society in terms of changing because it really is working towards changing this perception that's built up over the last 25 years of what an immigrant is. And I think it's just powerful that for those of you here, particularly in a place like New York City where you have the opportunity to go to school, I think that's all the more reason to keep at it and keep in the struggle and keep trying to build it up, so bring more people into it, because that's how I think ultimately it's really about changing the larger society and their perception of immigrants. And I think you guys are really at the forefront of that.
Let me say one more thing too. You may not feel like it, but I think you are in many ways the privileged elite. And if you want to actually make connections with people who you could really help, let me just give you an example. We're starting a new project at Boston College to reach out to juvenile offenders. Because this is the cohort that actually needs to get the message. People who are 15, 16, 17, maybe even 14, who are starting to pick up some juvenile offenses. You don't get deported for a juvenile offense, but if you don't become a citizen when you turn 18, you're very likely to pick up that first adult offense at the age of 18 or 19, and then you're out. So we're trying to educate those young people, both to educate them, but also to try to get them naturalized quickly, so as to, it's sort of like a vaccination program, actually. And I think that for college students or graduate students, I'm not sure what level you're all at, but that would be a nice bridge, if you wanted to reach out to those groups. And I don't think anybody's doing it. I mean, we're starting this, but there may be other groups that are doing it, but I'm not aware of it in New York. But I think that would be a really interesting program also. I'm just full of work ideas for you guys. Get to work.
Okay, so we'll have to, call it close. Just one thing, just a couple of things, that if any university who's going to reach out, to young people, or obviously to the immigrant communities and vulnerable communities, it should be us, right? We are the immigrant university in the United States, let's face it, and we're proud of that, and that's why, just this afternoon, Bernard and I were walking around here somewhere, and someone said, asked one of my colleagues, where was this place? And she said, this is it, in the moot court, and she said, what do you want it for? And I said, well, we have a meeting tonight at 5 o'clock, and Bernard's from Jamaica, he's going to talk about deportation. And she said, deportation? You said deportation? My friend's in detention. She's been there for 2 months. She's going to be deported back to Senegal. And we don't know why, and we don't know this. I'm just going to go over to see her tonight, and the lawyer's taking all her money. And, and this goes on all the time, And in fact, one of the reasons we even had this initiative was, whenever it was, 6, 7 months ago, I went to the president and said, do you know how many hundreds of students are involved in either deportation proceedings or their families in it is, literally including hundreds. And so if any university is going to reach out and do this kind of work, it's going to be us. And we have that experience, and we have that power, and we have that commitment, and we need to follow through with it, and whatever. And the second thing is, I wrote to different people this morning. I thought we're coming to the end of the initiative, right? We've got a few more things going on. And what happens a lot with initiatives is that you have it, great experience, and then you move on to the next initiative, right? It's a very American thing, actually, to do that. Issues, very issue-oriented. And of course, we can't afford to do that. And, we have a momentum, and actually, if you look at the momentum here, John Jay said, it's been building up for well over a decade, which is actually quite unusual for that momentum to keep on going. So my suggestion was, to some people, but anybody can become involved, is that we should, at some point, either next semester or semester after, we should have a conference on the new American diaspora, and bring in, people from Cambodia, the Philippines, wherever parts of Asia, and bring in all these different experiences, so that we can all learn from one another. Bernard's, report from Jamaica was absolutely fascinating, and so on and so forth. And that we need that, we need that to bring us closer, to the issues, to obviously educate ourselves and to network together. But also, which is so important, and is to understand the possibilities. That not to give in to fatalism, not to give in to these structures of oppression, but they're only there, because we've allowed them to be there, right? I mean, let's face it, people, ICE agents are human beings, and they're human beings that go and pick people up and kick them out. They're not fucking, robots. They're not Robocops, right? They're trained. A lot of these people are trained at John Jay, actually, right? We have these slogans all everywhere, justice this and justice that. Well, I want to see some of it, right? Instead of, the College of Injustice, the College of Justice, right? So there's an issue whereby it's not that problem there, no, right? It's our problem. Right? It's the same as, deportees at the end of the book, I said they're not them, they're us. And it's terribly, terribly important to understand. And my final thing is, and I was just going to finish with this, I was just watching a documentary on Howard Zinn, the great historian of, America from Below, or whatever it's called, People's History of America. And at the end of the thing, and you always, someone said to him, well, this sort of questions. Well, how do Howard, 80 years later, or whatever you are, 2 years before you died, you don't come to this guy. How do you see the future? These ridiculous questions that you get. And I thought, how the hell is he going to answer this? Right. And the interesting thing is, he said this. He said, actually, we're not a people of hatred and a people of punishment. We live in a culture of punishment. We're not actually a people of punishment. It's actually, we are more often a people of compassion. And if you look at the history, as much as we've excluded a people or we've punished people, actually, we've achieved extraordinary levels of compassion and and solidarity, right? And it's that sort of realization of who we are. You know, what is our moral core, as Martin Luther King used to say? You know, what is our moral core in, you know, our day-to-day living? And how can that then, you know, transform us and transform our world? And I think that's kind of the point we're at. Thanks for coming.